Hey guys, ZombFox here, and today we're going to be starting a mini-series that I kind of teased a little bit in some of my other videos saying I had something to do with the original USFL, and as you can see by the title, we are going to be going through pretty much every single USFL draft, all four, and finding the biggest draft bust from each draft, which will ultimately get us to a final video where it'll be the biggest draft bust in the USFL history. Yes, there are four USFL drafts. To put it simply, there is one for each year the league played, and one for the final year that was supposed to be played in fall that, never happened. They did have a draft, so we're going to be doing each one. Now, since these are in different times and different, it's just kind of weird. Every one of these years is going to have a different set of rules. To put it simply, we can't look at the 1986 USFL draft and say this guy was bad in the USFL because the USFL didn't actually play that year. But for this video and the 83 draft, we are specifically viewing how they did in the USFL. What they did in the NFL, the CFL, the AFL, none of that matters. It is purely based on what they did in the USFL. Now, the one big asterisk is that they have to have actually played in the USFL. If they were picked in the USFL draft, but ultimately signed with the NFL when they got picked in the NFL draft, they will not be counted. And as for another thing, I feel that for a player to be a true draft bust, a true big one, they have to be a first-round pick. So, for all four of these videos that will be in the, first parts, they will be a first-round pick player. So, without further ado, let's get started in the 1983 USFL draft, finding who is the biggest draft bust. With the number one overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Los Angeles Express picked Dan Marino. Yes, Dan Marino was actually the first overall pick in the USFL history, which is pretty honestly good. It shows that the LA Express did know what they were, dealing with in terms of quarterbacks. As in the NFL, Dan would end up being the fifth picked quarterback in the NFL, and he was the first pick in this draft. Naturally, he is not up for debate on the biggest draft bust in the USFL since he didn't play in the USFL, but naturally, it's fun to go over what he did do in his career. To put it simply, he is, let's just say, an above-average quarterback. He is only a Hall of Famer in both the pro and college level. He only had over 400 touchdowns. He had over 60,000 passing yards. He was just under a 60 completion percentage, and he was a 9-time Pro Bowler. So no joking, he is pretty much unanimously viewed as the greatest quarterback to never win a Super Bowl, and he is up there for the best player in the NFL, and quite frankly, all sports to never win the big game, or, the big title. He was an MVP, he was Comeback Player of the Year, Walter Payton Man of the Year, first team All-Pro multiple times, passing yard leader, he had the first 5 or 50 touchdown season. It's just, this guy was insane. If people have seen him play, they will always testify that he was still the greatest passer we've ever seen. He is not the biggest bust, and he is without a doubt a great player. Though, he does have a pretty good bust in canon. With the second overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Chicago Blitz selected Tim Spencer. Tim Spencer might not be the most notable USFL player, to put it simple, but he was a very solid player. To put it simply, he was with the Blitz for the 2 years they existed, as they were the Blitz, and they had this insanely weird merger, or pretty much a franchise swap with the Wranglers. But to put it simply, he was with the Blitz the whole time. The Blitz became the Wranglers, and so he was with them. Then, after the second year, he ended up going to the Showboats. He was a 1,000-yard rusher twice. He had over 500 yards one year. He wasn't ever, an all-USFL player or all-star member, but he was a very solid player, and his teams did make the playoffs every year. In fact, he did get to the championship game. Granted, they did fall to the, Philadelphia Stars, who were that mini dynasty. But I'm pretty sure he ended up finishing third all-time in USFL rushing yards. To put it simply, he is definitely not one of the biggest busts in the USFL, and he pretty much wasn't even a bust himself. He just, if you define a bust as, not being an all-star type player despite being a high pick, then I guess he is. But overall, Spencer had a very solid career in the USFL. He lasted a few years in the NFL afterwards, and he's overall been a pretty solid guy. Very solid guy in the USFL sense, so there's not much to really write home about in a negative way. He was a solid player who just never won or was never the top tier guy at a position that was pretty, contested in the USFL. With the number 3 overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Birmingham Stallions selected Reggie Collie. To put it simply, he is the first player that we're talking about that actually has a case to be known as the biggest bust in the USFL for 83 season. To put it simply, with the Stallions, he would only be there 1 year. He would get hurt and he didn't play a ton there. And what he did play, he didn't really show that good signs. To put it simply, when you throw 1 touchdown and 7 interceptions, there is nothing to say, but that is terrible. So that was a really big deal. His 37.7 quarterback rating is not that good, especially considering the fact that he got sacked for 132 yards itself, and rushing, he only rushed for 250 yards and 4 touchdowns. Isn't the best. But the Stallions would get pretty good compensation when they did end up trading him to the Federals, as they ended up getting the number 1 overall pick and some draft rights to a player who I don't think ended up playing. But the thing is, when he was, getting traded and stuff like that, he started doing, he was taking, drinking, using drugs and stuff like that. And it started then, and that definitely didn't help him, along with, this being the 80s and the stigma around a black quarterback wasn't, as good as it is now, where people seem to, not have it be as big a deal as it was back then. So with those two things going against him, and overall the fact that he didn't really end up starting until his last year in Orlando, as during the Federals, he was also hurt at some points, and when he did play, just like his rookie year, he wasn't that good. He had 7 total touchdowns to 12 interceptions. Not to mention, he only broke barely 1,100 total yards while being sacked for 140 yards. His QBR did improve, but it's not that much considering the fact he went from 37.7 to 51.3. Then his last year when he did start every game, he only had 2,578 yards, though he did actually have more touchdowns than interceptions, as he had in total a pretty respectable 25 touchdowns, which is respectable since he had 12 rushing, which is definitely impressive, to 16 picks. But since this is, an 18-game season and things like that, it makes those numbers seem not as great. But the fact is he did have over 3,000 yards total, but his below 70 rating again, and the fact that he never made it to the playoffs, and the fact that he was a top pick quarterback and was the highest picked quarterback to, play in the USFL, it's really a bad sign overall for him. So he definitely has a case to be the biggest bust in this draft. But we're not done yet. We're only, a fourth the way through. With the number 4 overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Washington Federals selected Craig James. Now, we're starting to get to another potential biggest draft bust. To put it simply, Craig James only was in the USFL for 2 years, as he was with the Federals for both years, but to put it simply, injuries really did hurt his career. He ended up only having 820 yards in his first year, as well as 4 touchdowns, while only playing in 14 games, and then his second season, he ended up having just 60 yards as he got hurt again. And considering the fact he only had 300 yards receiving and a couple of touchdowns, he overall did not really do anything in the USFL. Now, in the NFL sense, yeah, he did have mainly a impressive year, as he did have some overall decent seasons. He was a Pro Bowler, and in just a fun fact, he was the last white running back to rush for 1,000 yards in a single season until Peyton Hillis, which, man, Peyton Hillis, what a throwback that is. But, in terms of the USFL, though, he really didn't do anything. To put it simply, he's definitely up there for the biggest bust, as he was only there 2 years and he didn't do anything. Naturally, him and Collier could have definitely helped each other out in that second year, if they were both healthy. We could have seen maybe them, make the Federals not a terrible team, but we don't know, as there's really not much to talk about. He got hurt, and, didn't do a ton when he did play, as naturally in 14 games. There was a running back in the USFL who, granted, that guy ended up, being named Herschel Walker, and he was able to, pretty much rush for 1,800 yards. But, hey, you know what? Craig James, he at least, did have over 1,000 yards 1 year combined, but he's definitely up there for the biggest bust. With the number 5 overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the New Jersey Generals selected Gary Anderson. Gary Anderson is, without doubt, one of the more underrated players in the USFL in terms of history, as, yes, the running backs, did have a couple huge names, especially Herschel Walker, Heisman winner Mike Rozier, and then, the great Kelvin Bryant, who was awesome in the USFL, but he was a very solid player. He ended up never playing for the Generals. He got traded really early on to the Bandits, and he played there for 3 years. But overall, he was solid. In '85, he ended up being on both the USFL All-League team and USFL All-Star team, which, to put it simply, if you're on both those teams, you had a really, really good year. And he did it for having, 1,200 rushing yards and also 678 receiving yards. We ended up having a couple other pretty, impressive stats. He played pretty much every game for the last 2 years, all 18. He ended up having 19 touchdowns rushing his second year, as well as 2 through the air. And his rookie year, he only was able to play half a season, yet still had over 800 total yards. He was a very solid running back, definitely an underrated player in the original USFL, and is definitely not up there for biggest bust. With the number 6 overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Arizona Wranglers selected Eric Dickerson. Just like Dan Marino, there's really not that much to say. Dickerson is one of the greatest running backs of all time. He was a college and Pro Football Hall of Famer. This guy had like 1,300 rushing yards. He had 90 touchdowns. He was an Offensive Player of the Year, a multiple-time rushing yards leader, a multiple-time first-team All-Pro. The guy has the record for the most rushing yards in a season at like 2,100. Only guy to have 2,100, by the way. He had the most rushing yards in a rookie season, and he has the most in a playoff game. This guy is just electrifying, and he's overall one of the all-time greatest running backs. This guy is without a doubt one of the best players the NFL's ever seen. And in terms of the USFL sense, he never went there, so he's not up there for the biggest bust. And to put simply, I kind of wish he would have gone to the USFL, because seeing him and Herschel Walker go at it could have been really fun, since we know how, dominant Herschel Walker was in his rushing ability in the USFL. That would have been really fun to see. But Eric Dickerson, awesome player. With the number 7 overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Oakland Invaders selected Billy Ray Smith Jr. As, put it simply, this is a guy that definitely not the most memorable player. Not trying to hate on Billy Ray Smith Jr., but if I say that name, I don't think many of you are going to remember he was picked in the USFL. I don't think many of you are going to remember he even played. Though, he did end up playing a while. He played like 10 years in the NFL for the Chargers. Solid player. He's a college football famer. In terms of the NFL sense, he was a solid player, but he was never one of those all-star guys. He was a second-team All-Pro one year, so he was, really great that 1 year and stuff like that. But overall, he's pretty much one of those guys you look at and you're like, he was great for his team, but in terms of, he's not a memorable guy. I'm trying not to, sound like I'm hating him. It's just, this is one of those guys that, he was solid. He was a good player, like really, really good player, but it's just kind of forgettable. He was picked in the USFL as a top pick. One of those things where you kind of say, man, I wonder how it would have gone if he had actually, went to the USFL instead. But in terms of the NFL, he did end up getting picked 5th overall, so you're probably going to go to the NFL if you're picked that high. With the number 8 overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Philadelphia Stars selected Irv Eatman. This is, to put it simply, this guy has a legitimate case to be the best player in the original USFL history. Not joking. He is literally the only guy who was on both the Sporting News USFL All-Star team and the USFL All-League team on both for all 3 years. No one else did that. Herschel Walker didn't do that. Sean Landeta didn't do that. Sam Mills didn't do that. He was the only guy who did that. He was an outstanding tackle in the USFL. He was a Man of the Year in '84. He was on the Philadelphia Stars, so naturally he went to 3 straight championship games and he won the last 2 of them. The Stars were the only team to make it to the playoffs all 3 years. He was awesome. He is one of the greatest players in the USFL sense. And the guy literally played every single game. He played 18 games, started 18 games all 3 years. He was a model of consistency, excellent tackle. And even in an NFL standpoint, he may not have been a Pro Bowler, All-Pro, but the guy played in the NFL for another 10 years, and he was a starter for over 100 games. Just outstanding player in the USFL, definitely one of the best, at minimum a top 10 USFL player. That's the bare minimum. This guy was great. The fact that he went 8th overall in a hindsight sort of way is insane, considering just how great he was in the USFL. Awesome player. Definitely not one of the biggest busts. With the number 9 overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Denver Gold selected Demetric Johnson. No, not the Demetric Johnson nowadays that's, a UFC fighter. This was the OG safety Demetric Johnson. He never played in the USFL. He had some decent years in the NFL, but he only ended up playing 5 years in the NFL. He was decent for a couple of years, but he never became a star or anything. Really is the only guy that, gives Billy Ray Smith Jr. a, run for his money on the most forgettable player from this draft. As I said before, he's definitely a solid player for the couple years of the Lions, but he would never became anything special. Definitely forgettable, but he never played in the USFL, so he can't be one of the biggest busts. With the number 10 overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Michigan Panthers selected David Greenwood. David Greenwood was, he had a pretty cool USFL career. For the 2 years he was in Michigan, he was actually the team's starting punter. I'm not joking. As well as their starting safety. He was a solid safety, a really solid safety, and then he was a very solid punter. And naturally, since he was on the Panthers, he ended up winning the title in the league's first year as a member of the Panthers. And in the second year, they got bounced in the playoffs. But his third year, he ended up playing with the Oakland Invaders naturally, as, the Panthers pretty much became them, merger, teams moving, stuff like that. And they ended up losing in the championship game. So he ended up playing in 2 of the 3 championship games. And in 83, his rookie year, the Sporting News viewed him as an all-star safety. And so he was on that all-star team as a safety that first year. Overall, he may not be one of the all-time biggest stars in the league, but he was a very solid player in the USFL who never was able to really, catch on in the NFL. But the guy did have 9 total interceptions in the USFL, as long as 5 total sacks. But the fact that he was a punter for the 2 years he was with Michigan when they were in Michigan, and the fact that he played all 3 years, was an all-star member, and was a very solid player. He's definitely not one of the biggest busts. He's a very solid player. He's not one of the best, but a very, very, very solid player nonetheless. With the number 11th pick in the 1983 USFL draft, the Chicago Blitz, from a pick from Boston, selected Tremaine Johnson. Yeah, the Chicago Blitz had 2 first-round picks. They, got Boston's first-round pick, the Boston Breakers. And with that pick, they selected a guy who, was worth trading for. To put it simply, Tremaine Johnson was a very, very solid player. Tremaine Johnson would end up only being in the league 2 years, sadly, for the USFL sense. But despite only being there 2 years, he was awesome those 2 years. He was on both the All-Star and All-League team both years, which pretty much shows that if he stayed a third year, he could have joined Irv Eatman as the only guy to be on all 3, or be on both all 3 years. In fact, in 1983, he was actually the receiving yard leader at 1322. Sadly, he never was able to do it. Since he was, playing for the Blitz, they had to, play Philadelphia's first year, and they ended up losing in the divisional round, which was the first round of playoffs that year. Then the second year, they ended up getting to the championship game, but they lost to Philadelphia. So he did make the playoffs both years he was in the league. As this was, he was also part of the Blitz Wranglers, swap, I guess. But he had over 1,200 yards both years and over 10 touchdowns both years. He was just an awesome player. Really, really was a great player. For USFL fans, stuff like that, it's a shame he wasn't able to play a third year to see what he could have done in overall sense. But he's definitely one of the best USFL receivers we've seen. Definitely not a bust. Awesome player. With the 12th overall pick in the 1983 USFL draft and the last pick in the first round, the Tampa Bay Bandits selected Jimbo Covert. To put it simply, Jimbo ended up not playing in the USFL. He went to the Chicago Bears. He played there from 83 to 91. He became a really outstanding offensive lineman and one of the better, tackles in the league for a while. He ended up being a 2-time first-team All-Pro. He was one of the greatest Bears of all time on their list. He was on the 80s All-Decade team, 2-time first-team All-Pro, Super Bowl champion, and in both the Pro and College Football Hall of Famer. He started nearly every single game he played in. Great player. Sadly, the last guy in the draft for the first round didn't go to the USFL, but he was an outstanding player nonetheless in the NFL, and, never played in the USFL, but so he's not up there for the biggest bust, but overall solid player. So with that, those are all the 12 first-round picks in the 1983 USFL draft. There were multiple guys who didn't end up playing in the USFL, multiple guys who were very big stars in the USFL, and 2 notable guys who have to actually argue for the biggest bust. It's Reggie Collie and then, Craig James. There's no real way around it. They are the 2 biggest busts from this draft, if you want to say it. But the big question is to define, can you legitimately look at one and say, bust? In terms of he did play in the USFL and he was a bust. For the Stallions, yeah, Collier was a bust. But they did get a first overall pick, which sadly the guy they drafted, Jerry Rice, decided to go to the NFL. But considering the fact that was a smart move, since he definitely didn't go number 1 in the NFL draft, we all know. But the fact is, Collier he never really did anything. That third year was the only year he was a legit starter and didn't do anything. And yeah, you could say there's, outside circumstances both in and not in his control that may have hurt him. But overall, the performance on the field has to show, and he did not show it that well. That being said, I truly do think Craig James is the biggest bust in the 1983 USFL draft. The guy played 2 years, and he didn't even play a total of 1 year despite being in the league 2 years. He only played 14 games his rookie year. He didn't even do that much his rookie year, considering the fact that, remember, these are 18-game seasons. So 1,000 yards is still impressive, but he had 2 more games to do it than he did in the NFL. So, yes, it's, decent, but the fact that he didn't have 1,000 yards rushing, or, 1,500 yards combined, isn't a good sign. And overall, I can't just say he's not the biggest bust because he got hurt. No. The fact is, when he was healthy, he wasn't really worthy of being that top pick. There were running backs picked after him who were better. There were running backs signed as free agents that were better than him. So I think it's without really saying anything that he is definitely, I genuinely think, he is the biggest bust in the 1983 USFL draft. He'll be the first guy to be brought up in terms of the biggest overall bust in my finale video. He will be up there for it. But as for today, Craig James is the biggest draft bust in the 1983 USFL draft. This has been ZombFox. If you enjoy this content, let me know if I upload any more videos. I don't know exactly when the 84 episode will come out. It should come out within the next couple weeks. This one took a little while longer than I wanted to make it because it's some stuff with the USFL and the new one, and there'll be some more, but we'll see. Overall, subscribe if you like this content. Just hit the bell to be notified as soon as I upload any videos. As always, have a great night.